Hi, I'm Michael Lindenberger with the Dallas Morning News editorial board. This morning I interviewed Tom Wainwright of The Economist. He's the author of the new book, Narconomics, and it looks at the drug business in Mexico and Central America and elsewhere from the eyes of an international business, which of course they are. Anyway, it's a great book. I'd like for you to hear this interview. Thanks.
Sure. Well, I'm Tom Wainwright. I'm the Britain editor of The Economist, and I've just published my first book, which is called Narconomics: How to Run a Drug Cartel. And it's a sort of business analysis of the drug trafficking gangs, which we normally cover as a war or as sort of solely a crime story. But my idea is that if you treat them as businesses and apply a bit of basic economic reasoning to them, you learn stuff about them that you wouldn't otherwise have known.
How complicit are consumers in the deaths caused by the cartels?
I think anybody who buys illegal drugs is complicit in what the cartels do, and this is the case not just in the States but in Europe as well. I think people don't think about it, or perhaps don't want to think about it. But there's a reason that your gram of cocaine costs $100 when it's no harder to grow than coffee. The reason that it costs that much is because you're paying the wages of the people who cut off people's heads, and that's an expensive business.
Is cocaine their largest product, or is marijuana or heroin or?
It depends a lot on the cartel actually. The overall worldwide marijuana is certainly the most widespread drug in terms of the amount that it's taken. And most people reckon that in terms of revenues it's probably also the biggest. Of that $300 billion a year I mentioned, people tend to reckon marijuana is about 140 billion thereabout. So no one knows exactly,
Right,
obviously,
right.
but that's the best guess. So marijuana is the biggest earner. Cocaine, though, on the whole, is thought to be the most profitable. It's much, much more profitable to smuggle. I mean, just imagine smuggling marijuana, which in the States might sell for $5 a gram. Cocaine sells for maybe $150 per pure gram. And so, well, for the cartels, I think legalization is actually rather worrying from their point of view, which means for the rest of us it's potentially quite encouraging. For some cartels, cannabis, marijuana makes up about half of their revenues. So the Sinaloa cartel, for instance, which is the one that's run by Joaquin Guzman, this guy El Chapo, who was
Right.
captured just recently, that is thought to make about half of its income from marijuana, or at least it did. What's happened since Colorado and Washington State, Oregon, Alaska, and potentially a few more legalized it for recreational purposes is that those cartels now have a very serious legal competitor in the States. And they're finding it much, much harder to sell their product. But what's happening now is that the case for legalizing marijuana is increasingly being fought not just by libertarians but by conservatives who say, look, we've done our best to ban this stuff for decades. At the moment, something like 45% of Americans still say that they've tried marijuana, including the President of the United States. If he's done it, then you can't rule out the chances of your own kid doing it, right?
Right.
And people are saying, well, if we're going to have this market, then it's not really a choice between having drugs and not having drugs. It's a choice between having drugs that are managed and sold by doctors and by pharmacists, or having drugs that are sold by the mafia, which is what we're doing at the moment. And when you put the choice in those terms, legalization seems, like a kind of more sensible conservative thing to do than people thought. Um, I was talking to President Calderon, the president of Mexico before the current one, and he put it very succinctly. He said, "Look, either you have to stop buying these drugs, or you have to find what he called market alternatives. So, in other words, legalization as a way of doing it." And what I think cannot continue is countries, including the United States and including the countries of Western Europe, simultaneously saying that these products have to be illegal and yet buying ton after ton of the very same products. Because as long as they do that, a huge criminal market is going to exist, both in the rich world and in countries like Mexico. So I think really those who buy these products have blood on their hands. That's the only way you can put it. Well, the idea for the book came around when I wrote a story for the business section of The Economist about the economics of the cartels. And what began as a kind of satirical idea made me soon think, actually, maybe there's really something in this. And the more I looked into it, the more I thought, actually, that these cartels do have things in common with businesses, and maybe this is something to look at more closely. So after that period, I started every time I wrote a story about the drugs business, I would try to ask the same kinds of questions that I would ask of ordinary businesses. So I'd start asking, instead of just about the violence and about the, all the bloody stuff and the beheaded bodies and things that we see all the time, I tried to get down a bit deeper into the numbers of the business and try to figure out how they worked. And so for the next, I don't know, I guess I spent 2 or 3 years really gradually gathering the reporting behind this book. And it included speaking to, in some cases, gang leaders, in some cases, paid assassins, in some cases, smugglers, and also the people who regulate this business. So the police officers, the politicians, the diplomats, in some cases. And I asked all of these guys, business questions. And in terms of how I saw them, I mean, it was a mixture of different ways. Some of the gang leaders I interviewed actually in jail, because a lot of them carry on their businesses in jail, and that's a relatively safe place for a reporter to go and see them. Sure. Well, this was really, it came home to me actually when I went to interview the leader of one of the main gangs in El Salvador, a guy called Carlos Mojica, who runs the 18th Street gang, which is one of the two big gangs in the country. And one of the things that struck me talking to him, he was in jail at the time, but it didn't seem to stop him running his operation at all. And one of the things talking to him that came out was that the kind of human resources problem that drug cartels face is one of their most serious difficulties. And if you think about it, it's really tough for them. I mean, they have a very, very high turnover of their staff because their guys are constantly being either killed or arrested. And to give one example, I spoke to one person who'd looked into the business of transporting cocaine from the Caribbean to the UK, and he found that about a quarter of all the drug mules that make that route are stopped and arrested. And if you picture trying to run a regular business, imagine trying to run a newspaper where a quarter of your staff get taken out of the picture every year or with every transaction. It's really hard for them. And it's not just that, it's also, when they want to replace someone, they can't just advertise in the paper that they want a new hitman or whatever, and they can't look on LinkedIn. And so what they, to solve this problem, I was thinking if you wanted to really come up with a perfect way for them to solve this problem, what you'd really want to do would be to come up with some kind of place where you could get together a load of young guys with criminal records, with no job, with nothing to do, put them all in one place for the cartels to go and be able to hire them. And ideally you could even lock them in this place for several years to make absolutely certain that they could get hired. And, you can see where I'm going with this. This is exactly what we do. We build these places called prisons. They cost the taxpayer huge sums of money. And what they effectively work as is recruiting grounds for the cartels. And this is where they hire most of their best people. And there are all kinds of good examples of this. I mean, Carlos Leda, who is this guy who you may have seen on the Netflix series Narcos. If anybody can claim to have introduced America to cocaine, it's possibly him. His business really began when he was locked by coincidence in the same jail cell as a guy called George Young. And it was a perfect match because Carlos Leda had these contacts in Colombia. George Young was an American who had been transporting marijuana into the States by plane. So you put these two guys together and they thought, hey, why don't we start bringing in cocaine by plane? And that's what they did. And he said later, Carlos Leda said later, that prison had been like his college. This was a jail in Connecticut, and it was thanks to his imprisonment there that he was put together with this guy George Young, and the rest is history. So prisons are one area where I think there's a lot more that could be done.
Trump becomes president, will he get Mexico to pay for that wall?
Good luck with that. That's what I'd say to him. I think he'll have some trouble. And I think if he becomes president, then that won't be the only problem on America's hands, frankly. There was one interesting case where I interviewed a lady who was working as a cleaner for a contact of mine. She cleaned his house, and this guy who I knew through other work related links said, you should come around and interview my cleaning lady. And I said, well, why is this? What story she got? And it turned out that she was planning to have somebody murdered. And so I sat down and I spoke to her, and she was this very kind of cozy great-grandmother in her 70s. She didn't seem like the kind of person who would be into the murder business. And we sat down and she made me some blueberry pancakes and very matter-of-factly told me about how she was planning this paid killing. And the reason that she was doing this was that in the area of Mexico City where she lived, there were some gangsters going around making people's lives a misery. They were robbing people's houses, they were having people killed. And she and her neighbours had gone to the police and said, you've got to do something about this. You know, these guys are running riot. And the police did nothing. They were too corrupt, they were too lazy, nothing happened. And so what happened next was that a few criminal contacts from one of the local organised crime gangs got in touch and said, hey, look, we understand these guys are causing you big problems. We know just how to deal with these guys. You know, we specialise in this kind of thing. Would you like us to take care of it? And so they thought for a while, and they thought, well, actually, maybe we do. And this, to me, was interesting because it seemed like that the cartels in this instance, the organised crime groups, were trying to get local people on board. We're trying to win the sort of trust and the approval of local people by providing public services of a very sinister type that the state was not providing. It was because the police were so hopeless that the cartels were able to get in there and say, look, you know, we can provide a kind of form of law and order. And they do this all over the place in Mexico. In some places they build churches even. They build, sports fields. In some places they've set up primitive social security systems.
So this is this corporate responsibility for the drug gangs.
Exactly. That's what it reminded me of. It's a kind of corporate social responsibility, and it's entirely cynical. It's right. Important to make clear that these guys are not responsible in any way. They're not doing anything good for Mexico. But the reason that people like El Chapo, for instance, are able to stay at large for so long, despite the fact that everybody in Sinaloa, it seems, has an idea of where he might be, is because many people locally don't want to tell the authorities where he is, partly because they're intimidated, but also because in some parts of the country, the cartels go out of their way to provide these so-called public services. And it's a kind of pattern that you see in ordinary business with corporate social responsibility, firms trying to launder their reputations, if you like.
How did you respond after you had your blueberry pancakes and you were apprised of this murder plot? What did that present ethical issues for you, or how did you respond to that?
Well, I didn't report her to the police, if that's what you're asking. I mean, it's a tough question that you come across in Mexico a lot when you're reporting this kind of thing, and I think as a reporter, I think you face this dilemma very often. We saw a kind of extreme case of it recently with this Sean Penn interview that he did with El Chapo. And in a case like that, if you get the chance to interview someone like this, or someone who's working for a cartel, or someone who has worked for a cartel in the past, as I occasionally interviewed these people in my book, you have a dilemma about whether you see them at all or not. Oh, the Sean Penn thing. Well, I mean, I've got mixed views on it. I thought so to give the guy credit, he went and saw the guy in his, he saw the lion in his den. That took some guts, and I'm not sure if I would have done that, frankly. That was a big risk, and I think that took some bravery and maybe some naivety on his part. So, credit to him for that. And he went to see him, and it was, I read the story, and it was an interesting read. I think the stuff that a lot of people criticised him for, and including me, there were a few things. One is that they gave El Chapo copy approval of the story, and right. You and I both know that's something that you shouldn't do ever, right? And let alone in the case of a mass murderer, it's not really something any journalist should do. The other thing that I thought was a shame was that he didn't seem to get much out of the guy, considering he was with him for kind of 6 hours or something, and we hardly learned anything. And the thing that worried me most was that I felt he was too quick to swallow the line that El Chapo was spinning him about how he was just this kind of honest guy making a living, and I think he said, he only resorts to violence as a last resort, and it's just not true. It's really not true. This is a guy who's had people burned alive, buried alive, flayed alive. You cannot write about El Chapo without making this stuff crystal clear, and without making clear that the people who buy his products in the United States are the ones who are paying for this stuff to happen.
I think